was royalty, born to be caged in luxury. But one night, she chose the unknown. What happens when a princess trades her crown for muddy paths, starry skies, and the eyes of a man who has nothing but everything she's ever wanted? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The stone walls of Ravenswood Castle rose like ancient sentinels against the gray English sky, their surfaces weathered by centuries of rain and wind that swept across the northern moors. Within those formidable walls, in the highest tower of the eastern wing, Princess Eleanor Ashworth stood before a narrow window, her fingers pressed against the cold glass as she gazed longingly at the world beyond her gilded cage. The morning light cast a pale glow across her face, illuminating features that had been praised throughout the realm for their ethereal beauty. Her hair, the color of burnished copper, cascaded down her back in thick waves that caught the light like flames dancing in darkness. Her eyes, a striking shade of emerald green, held a depth of longing that no amount of luxury could satisfy. She wore a gown of deep burgundy wool, richly embroidered with golden thread that formed intricate patterns of roses and thorns along the bodice and sleeves. The dress was layered with a surcoat of darker crimson, trimmed with soft ermine fur at the collar and cuffs, befitting her station as the only daughter of King Harold III. A delicate circlet of gold rested upon her brow, set with small rubies that glinted like drops of blood against her pale skin. Eleanor had lived her entire 20 years within these castle walls, her life dictated by the rigid protocols of court and the endless expectations placed upon a royal princess. Every moment of her day was prescribed, from the morning prayers in the castle chapel to the evening banquets where she sat in silent dignity while nobles and courtiers discussed matters of state and politics. Her education had been extensive, tutored in languages, music, literature, and the arts of diplomacy, yet she had never been permitted to experience the simple freedoms that even the lowest peasant in her father's kingdom enjoyed. The world beyond the castle gates remained a mystery to her, known only through the stories told by traveling merchants and the songs of wandering minstrels who sometimes performed in the great hall. "My lady, you must prepare yourself for the morning audience," came the gentle voice of Matilda, her lady-in-waiting, who had served Eleanor since childhood. The older woman entered the chamber carrying a heavy cloak of deep blue velvet lined with wolf fur, the color chosen to complement the princess's gown for the day's formal proceedings. Matilda's face bore the lines of a life spent in service to the crown, her gray hair tucked neatly beneath a modest wimple of white linen. She had witnessed Eleanor grow from a curious child into a restless young woman, and she understood better than most the princess's yearning for something more than the life prescribed for her. Eleanor turned from the window, her expression one of barely concealed frustration. "Another morning of sitting beside my father's throne, listening to petitions and disputes that hold no meaning for me," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Tell me, Matilda, is this truly all that life holds for someone of my birth? To be a decoration in my father's court, to be traded like a prize mare to whichever foreign prince offers the most advantageous alliance?" Matilda approached her mistress with the practiced grace of long service, draping the cloak around Eleanor's shoulders and fastening it with a silver brooch shaped like a raven, the symbol of House Ashworth. "It is the way of the world, my lady," she replied softly, though her eyes held a sympathy that belied her dutiful words. "Your father the king loves you dearly, but he also bears the weight of the kingdom upon his shoulders. A marriage alliance could secure peace with our neighbors and strengthen our position among the great houses of England." "Peace," Eleanor repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "What do I know of war or peace? I have never seen a battlefield, never witnessed the suffering of common people, never walked through a village market or felt the rain upon my face without a canopy held above my head. I am a prisoner here, Matilda, dressed in fine silks and jewels, but a prisoner nonetheless." She moved to a polished bronze mirror that stood in the corner of her chamber, studying her reflection with critical eyes. The face that looked back at her was beautiful, she knew, but it was also the face of someone who had never truly lived, never made her own choices, or followed her own desires. The sound of a bell tolling from the castle's central tower signaled the beginning of the morning court session. Eleanor took a deep breath, composing her features into the mask of serene dignity that was expected of her. She had perfected this expression over the years, a pleasant smile that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil. eyes that looked upon the proceedings with apparent interest, while her mind wandered to distant places she had never seen. Together with Matilda, she made her way through the castle's winding corridors, past tapestries depicting the glorious victories of her ancestors and portraits of stern-faced kings and queens who had ruled before her father. Servants bowed low as she passed, their eyes averted in respect, and guards in steel breastplates and leather jerkins stood at attention, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. The great hall of Ravenswood Castle was an imposing space, its high ceiling supported by massive oak beams blackened with age and smoke from countless fires. Long banners bearing the raven sigil of House Ashworth hung from the walls, interspersed with the emblems of vassal houses sworn to her father's service. At the far end of the hall, upon a raised dais, stood 2 thrones carved from ancient oak and adorned with iron fittings. King Harold III sat upon the larger of the 2, a man of imposing stature despite his 50 years, his broad shoulders draped in a cloak of black wool trimmed with silver fox fur. His crown, a circle of dark iron set with obsidian stones, rested heavily upon his graying head. His face was weathered and stern, marked by the burdens of rulership and the countless difficult decisions a king must make. Beside him, the smaller throne awaited Eleanor, and she took her place there with practiced grace, arranging her skirts and folding her hands in her lap in the manner she had been taught since childhood. The morning's proceedings began with a steady stream of petitioners seeking the king's justice or favor. Merchants complained of unfair taxes levied by local lords. Farmers sought redress for lands seized by more powerful neighbors, and minor nobles presented grievances against one another that often stemmed from generations-old feuds. King Harold listened to each case with careful attention, rendering judgments that were firm but fair, his deep voice resonating through the hall as he dispensed the law of the realm. Eleanor sat motionless beside him, her face a perfect mask of royal composure, though her mind drifted far from the matters at hand. As the hours wore on, Eleanor found herself imagining what life might be like beyond the castle walls. She pictured herself walking through meadows filled with wild flowers, their colors bright against the green grass, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face without the barrier of glass between her and the sky. She imagined the sound of a rushing stream, the smell of fresh bread baking in a village oven, the laughter of children playing in a courtyard without the watchful eyes of guards and servants. These were simple pleasures, she knew, things that common people experienced every day without a second thought, yet they were denied to her by virtue of her birth. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had everything that wealth and status could provide, hungered for the very things that those with nothing took for granted. "You seem troubled, daughter," came her father's voice, low enough that only she could hear it. The morning's audience had concluded, and the petitioners were filing out of the great hall, leaving the king and princess alone upon the dais, save for the ever-present guards who stood at attention along the walls. King Harold turned to Eleanor with eyes that were shrewd and penetrating, missing nothing despite the countless cares that weighed upon him. "You barely attended to the proceedings. Your thoughts were elsewhere." Eleanor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Her relationship with her father was complicated, built upon genuine affection but strained by their fundamentally different views of her role and future. "Forgive me, Father," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "I find myself wondering about the lives of those who came before you today, the farmers and merchants who live beyond these walls. What must it be like to wake each morning not knowing exactly what the day will bring, to make choices that determine the course of one's own life?" The king's expression softened slightly, though concern flickered in his eyes. "The common people face hardships you cannot imagine, Eleanor. Their lives are filled with toil and uncertainty, with hunger in lean years and fear of bandits on the roads. You have been spared such burdens, raised in comfort and safety. That is a privilege, not a curse." He reached out to place a weathered hand upon her shoulder, his touch gentle despite the calluses earned from years of wielding a sword. "I know the constraints of your position chafe at times, but you must understand that your duty to this kingdom is as important as mine. The alliances you will forge through marriage, the heirs you will provide, these things ensure the stability and prosperity of our realm long after I am gone." "And what of my own happiness, Father?" Eleanor asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. "Does that matter at all in these grand calculations of duty and alliance?" She saw the flash of pain in her father's eyes and immediately regretted her sharp tone. but the words could not be unsaid. King Harold was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as if seeing something far beyond the stone walls of his hall. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old sorrow. "I loved your mother deeply, Eleanor. Ours was a marriage arranged for political advantage, yet we found genuine affection and respect in each other. It is my hope that you will be equally fortunate in the match we arrange for you." He paused, then added with uncharacteristic gentleness, "But I am not blind to your restlessness, daughter. I see how you look out the windows, how your spirit yearns for something beyond what we can offer you here. I wish I could give you the freedom you desire, but I cannot. The crown I wear is both a blessing and a burden, and you share in both whether you wish it or not." Before Eleanor could respond, the heavy doors of the great hall swung open with a groan of old hinges, and Lord Garrett Thornfield strode into the chamber with the confidence of a man long accustomed to power and privilege. He was a nobleman of considerable influence, master of vast estates in the southern reaches of the kingdom, and a man known for his ruthless ambition beneath a veneer of courtly sophistication. His appearance was striking, with sharp features framed by dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and eyes of a cold gray that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they surveyed. He wore a doublet of rich green velvet over a tunic of fine linen, with a cloak of black wool clasped at his shoulder with a gold brooch set with emeralds. At his side hung a sword with an ornate hilt, more a symbol of status than a weapon he would likely ever use in actual combat. "Your Majesty," Lord Thornfield said, bowing deeply to the king before turning his attention to Eleanor with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Princess Eleanor, you grow more radiant with each passing day. It is a blessing to behold such beauty gracing our court." His words were honeyed, practiced flattery that set Eleanor's teeth on edge, though she maintained her composure with the discipline of years of training. "Lord Thornfield," King Harold acknowledged with a nod that held neither warmth nor coldness, the careful neutrality of a ruler dealing with a powerful but potentially troublesome vassal. "What brings you to court today? I had not expected your arrival." The nobleman's smile widened slightly, a predator scenting opportunity. "I have come to formally present a proposal that I hope will be of great benefit to your Majesty and to the kingdom as a whole." He paused for effect, his gaze flickering between father and daughter. "It is past time, I believe, that Princess Eleanor was wed. The realm requires the stability that comes from a clear line of succession, and there are many among the nobility who would consider it a great honor to unite their house with yours through marriage to your daughter." Eleanor felt her heart sink, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had known this moment would come eventually, but the reality of it struck her with unexpected force. Lord Thornfield continued, his voice smooth and persuasive, outlining the advantages of an alliance between House Ashworth and his own considerable holdings, speaking of trade routes and military support and all the cold calculations that went into such arrangements. Her father listened with the attention he gave to all matters of state, asking pointed questions and considering the proposal from every angle. Neither man seemed to notice or care that the subject of their discussion sat before them, her fate being decided as if she were property to be bartered rather than a living person with thoughts and feelings of her own. "I will consider your proposal, Lord Thornfield," King Harold said finally, his tone giving nothing away. "Such matters require careful deliberation. You will have my answer in due course." It was a dismissal, politely phrased but unmistakable, and the nobleman had no choice but to bow and withdraw, though not before casting one more calculating glance at Eleanor. That evening, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, her mind churning with thoughts of Lord Thornfield's proposal and the future that seemed to be closing in around her like a trap. She lay in her bed, surrounded by pillows stuffed with goose down and blankets of the finest wool, yet she felt no comfort in these luxuries. The chamber was dark save for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. Through her window she could see the moon hanging in the night sky, full and bright, illuminating the landscape beyond the castle with silvery light. Something about that luminous orb called to her, speaking of freedom and possibility, of a world waiting to be discovered beyond the confines of her gilded prison. Rising from her bed, Eleanor moved to the window and gazed out at the moonlit countryside. In the distance, she could see the dark shapes of hills rolling away toward the horizon, forests that she had never walked through, villages whose names she knew only from maps in her father's study. The spring air that seeped through the gaps around the window frame carried the scent of growing things, of earth awakening after winter's sleep, and it filled her with a longing so intense it was almost painful. She thought of Lord Thornfield's cold gray eyes, of the future that awaited her as his wife, or the wife of some other nobleman chosen for political advantage, and she felt something inside her rebel against that fate with a strength she had never before experienced. For hours she stood at the window, watching the moon track across the sky, and as the night wore on, an idea began to take shape in her mind. It was reckless, dangerous, perhaps even foolish, but once it had taken root, she could not dislodge it. She would leave the castle, slip away in the darkness, and experience for herself the world she had only dreamed of. Just for a day or two, she told herself, long enough to see what lay beyond these walls, to walk freely under the open sky, to know what it felt like to make her own choices even if only for a brief time. The thought terrified her, even as it exhilarated her. But the alternative, surrendering to the life that had been planned for her without ever knowing what she was giving up, seemed infinitely worse. The decision made, Eleanor moved with quiet determination, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She could not take her fine gowns, the elaborate dresses that marked her as nobility would draw attention wherever she went. Instead, she rummaged through a chest at the foot of her bed, until she found a simple dress of undyed wool that Matilda sometimes wore when performing less formal duties. It was plain and rough compared to her usual garments, but it would allow her to pass as a common girl, perhaps a merchant's daughter or a farmer's niece. She pulled off her nightgown and slipped into the simple dress, finding the coarse fabric strange against her skin, but not unpleasant. Over this, she wrapped a cloak of dark brown wool, plain and serviceable, with a hood that could hide her distinctive copper hair. Moving to her jewelry box, Eleanor removed every piece of adornment, the rings and bracelets and necklaces that she wore daily. Her fingers hesitated over a small locket that had belonged to her mother, a simple silver piece engraved with roses, and after a moment's deliberation she slipped it into a pocket of her dress. It was the only connection to her mother she would carry, a reminder of who she was even as she pretended to be someone else. She plaited her long hair into a simple braid and tucked it beneath the hood of her cloak, checking her reflection in the bronze mirror and barely recognizing the plain-faced girl who looked back at her. The castle was quiet at this late hour. Most of its inhabitants long since retired to their beds. Eleanor knew the guard rotations, had observed them countless times from her window out of sheer boredom during sleepless nights. She waited until the changing of the watch, that brief window when the corridors would be most sparsely patrolled, and then slipped from her chamber like a shadow. Her heart hammered in her chest as she moved through the darkened hallways, pressing herself against the cold stone walls, whenever she heard footsteps approaching, holding her breath until the danger passed. The castle that had been her prison now became a maze she navigated with increasing confidence, her intimate knowledge of its layout serving her well. She made her way to the kitchens, knowing that the servants' entrance there would be the least guarded route out of the castle. The great ovens had been banked for the night, their fires reduced to coals that cast a dull red glow across the room. Long wooden tables where the cooks prepared meals for hundreds of people each day stood empty and clean, waiting for the morning's work to begin. Eleanor paused to gather some provisions, wrapping bread and cheese in a cloth and filling a small leather flask with water from a barrel near the door. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, the magnitude of what she was doing beginning to dawn on her, but she pushed her doubts aside and continued with her plan. The servants' door was barred from the inside with a heavy wooden beam, and Eleanor struggled to lift it, her arms unused to such physical labor. The beam was heavier than she had anticipated, rough wood that scraped her soft palms, but determination lent her strength, and finally she managed to raise it free of its brackets and set it aside with a soft thud that sounded deafeningly loud in the quiet kitchen. She froze, listening intently for any sign that the noise had drawn attention, but the castle remained silent around her. Slowly, carefully, she pulled the door open, wincing at every creak of its iron hinges, until at last there was a gap wide enough for her to slip through. The night air hit her like a physical force, cool and fresh and utterly unlike the stale atmosphere within the castle walls. Eleanor stepped out into the darkness, her feet touching grass for the first time in her life without the barrier of shoes or the confines of a walled garden. The sensation was startling, the damp earth beneath her thin slippers, the whisper of wind through nearby trees, the vast expanse of sky above her head unobscured by stone or glass. For a moment she simply stood there, overwhelmed by the sheer openness of it all, by the realization that there were no walls around her, no guards watching her every move, nothing but the night and the world and her own will to guide her steps. She followed the shadows along the outer wall of the castle, moving away from the main gates where guards stood watch with torches that cast pools of flickering light. The moon provided enough illumination to see by once her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she made her way toward the edge of the forest that bordered the castle grounds. Behind her, Ravenswood Castle rose like a mountain of stone against the night sky, its towers and battlements silhouetted in the moonlight, and for just a moment Eleanor felt a pang of guilt for the worry her disappearance would cause. Her father would be frantic when he discovered her gone, and Matilda would blame herself for not watching more carefully. But Eleanor pushed these thoughts away. She needed this, needed to know what the world was like, needed to live even if just for a little while before the doors of her cage closed forever. The forest welcomed her with a chorus of night sounds that were both frightening and exhilarating. Owls hooted in the branches overhead, small creatures rustled through the undergrowth, and somewhere in the distance a fox barked its eerie cry. Eleanor walked as quickly as she dared, following what appeared to be a narrow path that wound between the trees, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the castle before dawn broke and her absence was discovered. The rough fabric of her simple dress caught on brambles and low branches, so different from the carefully maintained gardens where she had been permitted to walk in her previous life, and she found herself laughing softly at the sheer reality of it all. The authentic experience of moving through an actual wild place, rather than a tamed and cultivated space. As the night slowly gave way to the gray light of pre-dawn, Eleanor emerged from the forest onto a hillside overlooking a valley she had often seen from her tower window but never visited. The view was breathtaking. Rolling meadows still touched with morning mist, a ribbon of river winding through the landscape, and in the distance the clustered buildings of a village just beginning to show the first signs of waking life. Smoke rose from chimneys as fires were stoked for the day's cooking, and she could just make out the tiny figures of people beginning their morning routines. It was a scene of such ordinary beauty that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple fact of being here, of seeing this with her own eyes rather than through a window from far away. She descended the hillside carefully, her legs unused to such exertion, her breath coming in short gasps by the time she reached the valley floor. The grass was wet with dew that soaked through her thin slippers, and her feet were soon cold and damp, but she found she did not care. Every sensation was new and precious, from the way the morning air smelled of earth and growing things to the sound of birds beginning their dawn chorus in the hedgerows that bordered the fields. She followed a cart track that led toward the village, her stomach fluttering with nervousness about what she would find there, whether anyone would see through her disguise and recognize her as the princess who should be safe in her tower at Ravenswood Castle. The village of Millbrook was larger than it had appeared from the hillside, a collection of perhaps 50 buildings clustered around a central square, where a well-provided water for the inhabitants. The houses were built of timber and wattle and daub, their thatched roofs showing the wear of many winters, so different from the stone grandeur of the castle Eleanor had left behind. As she entered the village, a few early risers gave her curious glances, but no one challenged her presence, accepting her as just another traveler passing through. She walked slowly through the narrow lanes, drinking in every detail with an intensity born of long deprivation, watching as a blacksmith opened his forge and began stoking the fire, as a woman threw grain to a flock of chickens that pecked and scratched in the dirt yard beside her cottage, as children emerged from doorways to begin their morning chores before the day's work truly began. Eleanor found herself drawn to the well in the center of the square, where several women had gathered with buckets and jars to draw water for their households. They chatted among themselves as they worked, their conversation a mixture of gossip and news, complaints about the weather and speculation about the harvest, the comfortable talk of people who had known each other all their lives. Eleanor stood at the edge of the group, uncertain how to join them, afraid that her inexperience with such simple tasks would betray her. But one of the women, a plump matron with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, noticed her hesitation and smiled. "New to Millbrook, are you?" the woman asked, her voice friendly and curious. "I'm Martha, wife to the baker Thomas. You look like you could use a good meal and a place to rest. Have you come far?" And there was no suspicion in her tone, only the natural hospitality of country folk toward strangers, and Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude for this simple kindness. "I am Eleanor," she said, giving her real name without thinking, then silently cursing herself for the slip, though no one seemed to find anything unusual about it. "I have walked through the night and I am rather tired." It was nothing but the truth, she realized, as the adrenaline that had sustained her during her escape began to fade, leaving her aware of her exhaustion and the blisters forming on her soft feet. Martha clucked her tongue sympathetically and took Eleanor by the arm with a motherly firmness that reminded her painfully of Matilda. "Come along then, child. You'll have breakfast with us, and then we'll see about finding you a place to stay if you're looking for work. The harvest season will be upon us soon enough, and there's always need of extra hands." She led Eleanor toward a building from which the most wonderful smell of fresh bread was emanating, talking all the while about the village and its inhabitants, pointing out various buildings and their purposes, introducing her to other villagers they passed along the way. The bakery was warm and welcoming, the heat from the ovens making the air thick and comfortable after the cool morning outside. Thomas the baker was a jovial man with flour dusting his arms and a ready smile, and he welcomed Eleanor into his home without question, setting before her a trencher of fresh bread still warm from the oven, a chunk of yellow butter, and a cup of fresh milk. Eleanor ate with an appetite sharpened by her night of walking, finding the simple food more delicious than any of the elaborate dishes served at her father's table, though whether that was due to the quality of the bread or her newfound freedom she could not say. As she ate, Martha continued to talk, and Eleanor learned that life in Millbrook, while hard, was filled with a sense of community and purpose that she had never experienced within the castle walls. People here depended on each other, helped one another through difficult times, celebrated together during festivals and holy days. It was a life of simplicity, but also of genuine connection, and Eleanor found herself enchanted by it all. After breakfast, Martha showed Eleanor to a small room above the bakery that was used for storing sacks of grain and flour, but which had a corner that could be cleared to make space for a sleeping pallet. "It's not much," Martha said apologetically, "but it's warm and dry, and you're welcome to stay here as long as you help out with the work. Can you cook? Sew? We always need assistance, especially with my daughter Mary away visiting her husband's family in the next village." Eleanor hesitated, realizing with embarrassment that she had no practical skills whatsoever. She had been taught languages, music, dancing, and courtly etiquette, but no one had ever shown her how to cook a meal or mend clothing or any of the countless tasks that common women performed every day. "I am afraid my education has been rather limited in practical matters," she admitted, feeling her cheeks flush with shame. "But I am willing to learn, if you would be patient enough to teach me." Martha laughed, a warm sound that held no mockery. "Well, we all start somewhere, don't we? You're honest about it at least, and that's worth something. Come along then. There's always work to be done, and the best way to learn is by doing." She led Eleanor back downstairs to the main room of the bakery, where Thomas was pulling fresh loaves from the stone oven with a long wooden paddle. The heat was intense, and Eleanor marveled at how casually he worked in such conditions, his movements practiced and efficient from years of labor. The morning passed in a blur of activity as Eleanor attempted to help with the various tasks required to run a bakery. Martha set her to kneading dough, showing her how to work the sticky mass with the heels of her hands, folding and pressing in a rhythmic motion that looked simple, but proved surprisingly difficult. Eleanor's arms ached within minutes, her soft hands unused to such sustained physical effort, but she persevered, determined to prove herself useful. The dough seemed to have a mind of its own, sticking to her fingers and the wooden board, refusing to achieve the smooth, elastic consistency that Martha produced so effortlessly. But gradually, with patient instruction, Eleanor began to understand the feel of properly kneaded dough. "You're doing well for your first time," Martha encouraged, watching as Eleanor worked. "Your hands are terribly soft, though. You've not done much work like this before, have you? What did you do before coming to Millbrook?" The question was casual, born of natural curiosity rather than suspicion, but Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat as she scrambled for a plausible answer. "My father was a minor clerk in a lord's household," she said, the lie coming more easily than she would have expected. "He educated me beyond what was perhaps necessary for someone of our station. hoping I might find a position as a governess or companion to a noble lady. But he passed away recently, and I found myself without prospects or protection. I thought it best to seek my fortune elsewhere, to find honest work and make my own way in the world. The story was elaborate enough to be believable, she hoped, explaining both her education and her lack of practical skills. Martha's expression softened with sympathy. "Oh, you poor child, to lose your father and be cast adrift so young. Well, you've found a home here for as long as you need it. We're simple folk in Millbrook, but we look after our own, and anyone willing to work hard is welcome among us." She patted Eleanor's shoulder with a flour-dusted hand, leaving a white print on the dark fabric of her cloak, and Eleanor felt a surge of affection for this kind woman who had taken in a stranger without hesitation. As the day progressed, Eleanor found herself fascinated by the rhythm of village life. Customers came and went from the bakery, purchasing bread and exchanging news and gossip with Thomas and Martha. She learned that the lord of the region, Baron Cedric Hartwell, was a fair but distant ruler, who collected his taxes through stewards and rarely visited Millbrook himself. She heard about marriages and births, about disputes between neighbors and concerns about raiders who had been seen in the hills to the north. The conversation was so different from the formal discourse of the court, filled with genuine emotion and personal investment in the lives of those discussed, and Eleanor listened with rapt attention, storing away every detail of this new world she had entered. In the late afternoon, as the day's baking was nearly complete and the shadows were beginning to lengthen across the village square, Eleanor heard the sound of bells in the distance. Not the deep, measured tolling of a church bell, but the lighter, brighter jingle of bells attached to a flock of sheep. She looked up from the table where she had been shaping small loaves under Martha's supervision, her hands still covered in flour, and saw through the open door of the bakery a remarkable sight that made her heart suddenly beat faster for reasons she could not immediately explain. A young man was walking through the village square, leading a flock of perhaps 50 sheep that flowed around him like a white river, their bells creating a musical chorus that seemed to fill the air. He was tall and powerfully built, his shoulders broad beneath a simple tunic of undyed linen worn over leather breeches that showed the wear of long use. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, falling to his shoulders in waves that caught the afternoon light, and even from a distance Eleanor could see that his face was striking, with strong features that spoke of both strength and gentleness. He carried a shepherd's crook in one hand, using it with casual expertise to guide his flock, and a leather satchel was slung across his back. His skin was bronzed from long hours in the sun, and he moved with an easy confidence that came from someone comfortable in his own body and his place in the world. Eleanor found herself staring, unable to look away from this stranger who seemed to embody everything that was different from her life at court. There was nothing refined or cultured about him, no carefully practiced courtly manners or elaborate dress. Yet there was something in the way he carried himself, in the gentle patience with which he tended his flock, that drew her attention like a flame draws a moth. She watched as he stopped at the well in the center of the square, allowing his sheep to drink from the trough while he drew water for himself, and she saw him exchange friendly greetings with several villagers who passed by, clearly well known and liked in Millbrook. "That's Wren Blackwood," Martha said, noticing Eleanor's interest with a knowing smile. "He tends the flocks for several of the farmers hereabouts, takes them up to the high pastures in the hills where the grass is sweet. A good lad, Wren, though he keeps to himself mostly. Lives in a small cottage on the edge of the forest with his younger sister, has done since his parents died in the fever that swept through here 5 years back. He was barely 17 then, but he took on the responsibility of caring for his sister and never complained, just worked harder than any 2 men to keep them both fed and sheltered." There was clear respect in Martha's voice, and Eleanor found herself wanting to know more about this young shepherd who had captured her attention so completely. As if sensing her gaze, the shepherd looked up from the well, and his eyes met Eleanor's across the distance of the square. They were gray, she saw, the color of storm clouds or winter steel, and they held an intelligence and depth that surprised her. For a long moment they simply looked at one another, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she had never experienced before, as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis. Then Wren smiled, a slow, genuine expression that transformed his serious face into something warm and approachable, and he raised his hand in a friendly wave before turning back to his flock. Eleanor realized she had been holding her breath and released it in a shaky exhale. her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion or fear. "Does he come to the village often?" she asked Martha, trying to keep her voice casual and not entirely succeeding. Martha's smile widened, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Often enough. He brings the flocks down every few days to water them and to sell wool and cheese at the market. Why do you ask, child? Has our handsome shepherd caught your fancy?" The teasing was gentle, without any real mockery, but Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at being so transparent. "I was merely curious," she said, focusing intently on the dough she was shaping, though her hands had suddenly become clumsy and awkward. "He seems different from the other men I have seen in the village. More solitary, perhaps." "Aye, that's true enough," Martha agreed, her expression becoming more serious. "Wren's always been a bit apart from others, even as a boy. He's kind and helpful when needed, but he prefers the company of his sheep and the quiet of the hills to the noise and bustle of village life. Some say it's because he feels the weight of his responsibilities so keenly, having to be both brother and parent to young Bryn. Others think he's simply got a contemplative nature, the sort that finds peace in solitude rather than crowds. Either way, he's well respected here, even if he is something of a mystery." Eleanor found herself thinking about the shepherd throughout the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, even as she helped Martha prepare supper and learned how to properly tend the fire in the hearth. There was something about him that called to her, though she could not have explained exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the freedom he represented, the life spent under open skies rather than within stone walls. Or perhaps it was simply that he was the first young man she had ever seen who was not a courtier or nobleman, someone whose worth was measured by his character and his work rather than his birth or political connections. Whatever the reason, she found herself hoping that she would have the opportunity to speak with him, to learn more about his life and the world he inhabited. That night, lying on her pallet in the small room above the bakery, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary day she had experienced. Her body ached in ways it never had before. Her hands were rough and sore from kneading dough. Her feet still hurt from the long walk through the night, but she felt more alive than she ever had within the comfortable confines of Ravenswood Castle. She had worked with her own hands, earned her keep through honest labor, been accepted by Martha and Thomas as simply Eleanor, a girl in need of help, rather than Princess Eleanor, a valuable political pawn. It was intoxicating, this taste of normal life, and she knew already that it would be impossibly difficult to return to her old existence when the time came. But for now, she told herself, she would not think about that inevitable return. For now, she would simply be here, in this moment, in this place, free to make her own choices and discover who she might be when stripped of all the trappings of royalty. And if her thoughts kept returning to a dark-haired shepherd with storm-gray eyes and a gentle way with his flock, well, that was simply part of the adventure she had embarked upon, was it not? The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a warmth that promised the full arrival of spring. Eleanor woke to the sound of activity in the bakery below, the familiar rhythm of Thomas beginning his day's work before the sun had fully risen. She dressed quickly in her simple woolen dress, splashed cold water on her face from a basin Martha had left for her, and made her way downstairs to help with whatever tasks needed doing. Her muscles protested the movement, stiff and sore from yesterday's unaccustomed labor, but she pushed through the discomfort, determined to prove herself capable and useful. Martha greeted her with a smile and a cup of weak ale, the standard breakfast drink for common folk. "Good morning, Eleanor. You slept well, I hope. Today is market day in Millbrook, which means we'll be busier than usual. People come from the surrounding farms to buy and sell, and everyone needs bread. Think you're up for another day of hard work?" The question was asked kindly, with genuine concern for Eleanor's well-being, and it warmed her heart. "I am ready to do whatever you need," Eleanor replied, and she meant it. The work was hard, yes, but there was a satisfaction in it that she had never found in her courtly duties, a sense of accomplishment in creating something tangible and useful with her own hands. The market day transformed the quiet village square into a bustling hub of activity that both overwhelmed and delighted Eleanor. Farmers arrived with carts laden with early spring vegetables, their wooden wheels creaking on the packed earth as oxen plodded patiently forward. Women set up stalls displaying pottery and woven baskets, lengths of homespun cloth and jars of honey preserved from the previous summer. The air filled with the mingled scents of livestock, fresh bread, herbs, and humanity, a rich tapestry of smells so different from the perfumed atmosphere of the castle that Eleanor found herself almost dizzy with the intensity of it all. Voices rose in a cheerful cacophony as neighbors greeted one another. Bargaining began in earnest, and children darted between the stalls with the boundless energy of youth, their laughter ringing out like bells. Martha had set up a table in front of the bakery, arranging the morning's loaves in neat rows that drew customers immediately. Eleanor stood beside her, watching carefully as Martha handled transactions, counting out small copper coins and making change from a leather purse tied at her waist. The bread sold quickly, and Eleanor found herself pressed into service, wrapping loaves in clean cloth and handing them to customers, receiving their thanks with a shy smile that seemed to charm the villagers. They were kind to her, these simple folk, accepting her presence without question, offering advice about settling into Millbrook and sharing bits of local gossip as if she had always been one of them. As the morning progressed, Eleanor found her gaze wandering across the crowded square, searching without conscious intention for a particular tall figure with dark hair and gray eyes. She told herself she was merely curious about the daily workings of the market, interested in observing all aspects of village life, but she knew she was lying to herself. There was something about Wren Blackwood that had captured her imagination in a way she did not fully understand, a pull that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest, irrational and undeniable. She was wrapping a loaf for an elderly woman when she heard the now familiar sound of sheep bells, and her heart immediately began to beat faster. Looking up, she saw Wren entering the square with a smaller flock than he had led yesterday, perhaps a dozen sheep that he guided with easy competence toward a pen that had been set up specifically for market day. He wore the same simple clothing, his tunic and leather breeches showing honest wear, but he had added a sleeveless jerkin of thick wool dyed a deep forest green that brought out the gray of his eyes. His dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, revealing the strong lines of his face, and Eleanor noticed for the first time the way the muscles of his forearms moved beneath sun-bronzed skin as he worked to settle his flock. "That's Wren's best breeding ewes," Martha observed, following Eleanor's gaze with a knowing expression. "He'll be selling some of them today, I expect, to raise coin for the spring planting. He keeps a small garden plot near his cottage, grows vegetables to supplement what he earns from shepherding. A man of many talents, our Wren, and hard-working as they come. Any woman would be fortunate to catch his eye, though he's never shown much interest in that direction. Too focused on caring for his sister and building his future, I suppose." Eleanor felt a strange flutter in her stomach at Martha's words, though she could not have said whether it was hope or disappointment that caused it. She watched as Wren completed his preparations, checking each sheep carefully, running his hands over their wool to ensure they were in prime condition for potential buyers. There was a gentleness in his touch that spoke of genuine care for the animals under his protection, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to be the recipient of such tender attention from someone who gave it so freely to those in his care. As if sensing her observation, Wren looked up and his eyes found hers across the crowded square. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade away, the noise and bustle of the market becoming a distant hum as they regarded each other in silence. Then Wren smiled, that same slow, genuine expression she had seen yesterday, and began making his way through the crowd toward the bakery stall. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and she felt Martha nudge her gently in the ribs, a silent encouragement that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment, even as her heart raced with anticipation. "Good morning, Martha," Wren said as he approached, his voice deep and pleasant, with an accent that marked him as local to this region. "I see you have a new assistant today. Have you finally convinced your Mary to come home from her husband's village?" His tone was friendly and teasing, the easy manner of someone who had known Martha for many years, but his eyes kept drifting to Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. Martha laughed and shook her head. "Mary's still away, but I've been blessed with help nonetheless. This is Eleanor, who arrived in Millbrook just yesterday seeking work and a place to stay. Eleanor, this is Wren Blackwood, the finest shepherd in 3 counties if you believe his customers, and only the second finest if you believe his own modest assessment." The introduction was made with Martha's characteristic warmth, and Eleanor found herself the focus of Wren's full attention, those storm-gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and valued. "Welcome to Millbrook, Eleanor," Wren said, inclining his head in a gesture of respect that was neither servile nor overly familiar. "I hope you'll find our village to your liking. It's a good place, with good people, if somewhat quieter than what you might be used to in larger towns." His assumption that she came from a more urban setting was natural enough given her educated speech, and Eleanor latched onto it gratefully as a cover for her true origins. "I have found nothing but kindness here," Eleanor replied, pleased that her voice came out steady despite her nervousness. "Martha and Thomas have been wonderfully generous, and the village is more beautiful than I could have imagined. I feel quite fortunate to have found my way here." It was nothing but the truth, she realized as she spoke. Despite the simplicity of her current circumstances, or perhaps because of it, she felt more content than she had in years within the luxury of Ravenswood Castle. Wren's expression softened at her words, and something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. "That's good to hear. It can be difficult, arriving in a new place where you know no one, but Millbrook has a way of making strangers feel welcome soon enough. If you have need of anything, or if you'd like to learn more about the surrounding countryside, I'd be happy to show you the paths through the hills. I know them better than most, spending so much time up there with the flocks." The offer was made casually, without any apparent ulterior motive, but Eleanor felt her pulse quicken at the prospect of spending time alone with this intriguing young man. Before she could respond, however, a commotion near the sheep pen drew Wren's attention. A young boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, had apparently gotten too close to one of the ewes and startled it, causing the animal to bolt and scatter several others in its panic. Wren excused himself with an apologetic smile and strode quickly back toward his flock, his long legs covering the distance in moments. Eleanor watched as he calmed the frightened sheep with gentle words and patient handling, his movements sure and confident, and she found herself admiring not just his physical strength but the calm authority he projected, the way both animals and people seemed to respond positively to his presence. "He likes you," Martha said quietly, drawing Eleanor's attention back to the bakery stall. "I've known Wren since he was a boy, and I've never seen him make such an offer to a stranger, especially not a young woman. He's cautious about who he lets into his life, protective of his time and his space, but something about you has caught his interest. Be careful with that, child. Wren's a good man, but his heart has been through its share of pain with losing his parents so young and carrying such heavy responsibilities. If you're not planning to stay in Millbrook long, it might be kinder not to encourage any attachment." The warning was gentle but sincere, and Eleanor felt a pang of guilt as she realized the truth of Martha's words. She had no intention of staying in Millbrook permanently, could not stay even if she wished to, not once her father's men inevitably tracked her down and returned her to the castle. This whole adventure was temporary, a brief escape before she was forced back into the role that had been prescribed for her since birth. To allow Wren to develop feelings for her when she knew she would ultimately have to leave would be cruel and selfish, yet the thought of keeping her distance from him, of denying herself the chance to know him better, felt like a loss she could not bear. "I understand," Eleanor said softly, though she was not certain she did, not really. Her emotions were a tangled mess, desire and guilt and longing all twisted together in a way that made clear thinking nearly impossible. "I would not wish to cause him pain, but surely friendship is possible without leading to deeper attachment. I know so little of this world, Martha, of how ordinary people live their lives. If Wren is willing to show me the countryside, to teach me about his work, would it not be wrong to refuse such generosity out of fear of what might or might not develop between us?" Martha studied her for a long moment, her wise eyes seeing more than Eleanor was comfortable revealing. "Just be honest with him, child. If you're only passing through, make sure he knows that from the start. Wren's not a fool, and he deserves to make his own choices with full knowledge of the circumstances. But yes, friendship is a good thing, and learning from those who know the land is never wasted time. Just guard both his heart and your own, for I suspect you're not as immune to his charms as you might wish to be." The rest of the market day passed in a blur of activity, but Eleanor found her thoughts returning again and again to Wren and the possibility of seeing more of the countryside that surrounded Millbrook. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he conducted business with various farmers, negotiating prices for his ewes with a quiet confidence that suggested he knew his worth and would not be cheated. Several times she caught him looking back at her, and each time their eyes met, she felt that same strange flutter in her chest, that sense of recognition that defied rational explanation. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen and the market crowd started to thin, Wren made his way back to the bakery stall. He had sold 3 of his ewes, Eleanor had learned from listening to the gossip around her, for a good price that spoke to the quality of his livestock. There was a satisfied expression on his face, the look of a man who had done good business and could be proud of his work. "Martha, might I purchase 2 of your fine loaves?" he asked, producing a small leather purse from his belt. "One for myself and one for my sister Bryn. She's particularly fond of your honey bread, claims it's the finest in the kingdom." He counted out the copper coins with careful precision, neither wasteful nor miserly, and Martha accepted payment with a smile. "Of course, Wren. And how is young Bryn doing? I haven't seen her in the village for some weeks now." Martha wrapped the loaves as she spoke, her movements practiced and efficient. "She's well, thank you for asking. Growing like a weed and getting more stubborn with each passing day," Wren replied with obvious affection. "She's 12 now, thinks herself practically grown, and chafes at my attempts to protect her. I sometimes wonder if I've been too strict with her, but when I remember how young she was when our parents died, how frightened and lost we both were, I cannot bring myself to relax my vigilance. The world can be harsh to those without family to protect them." There was a shadow of old pain in his voice, and Eleanor felt her heart ache with sympathy for this young man who had been forced to grow up too quickly, to shoulder burdens that should not have fallen on one so young. Without thinking, she spoke up, her voice soft but clear. "It sounds as though your sister is fortunate to have such a devoted brother. Many would have crumbled under such responsibility, but you have clearly done well by her. That is something to be proud of, not to doubt." Wren turned to her with an expression of surprise that quickly shifted to something warmer, more appreciative. "That's kind of you to say, Eleanor. I hope Bryn would agree, though there are days when I'm certain she would prefer a less protective guardian." He hesitated, then continued with what seemed like carefully considered words. "I meant what I said earlier about showing you the countryside. Tomorrow is the Sabbath, and I'll be taking the flocks to the high pastures in the morning, after attending services in the village chapel. If you'd like to accompany me, you'd be most welcome. The walk is not difficult, and the views from the hills are quite spectacular. You could meet Bryn as well if you wished. She sees few enough people other than myself, and I think she would enjoy the company of another woman, even if only for an afternoon." Eleanor's heart leaped at the invitation, though she was careful to keep her expression composed. "I would like that very much," she said, glancing at Martha for permission. "If Martha can spare me for the day, that is. I would not wish to shirk my duties here." Martha waved a hand dismissively, though her smile was knowing. "The Sabbath is a day of rest, child. You're entitled to spend it as you choose, and a walk in the fresh air would do you good. Just be back before dark, and mind that you dress warmly. The hills can be colder than the valley, even in spring." She looked meaningfully at Wren as she spoke, a silent communication passing between them that Eleanor could not quite interpret, but which seemed to satisfy the older woman. "I'll take good care of her, Martha. You have my word," Wren said seriously. "We'll keep to the safe paths, and I'll have her back well before sunset." He turned back to Eleanor, and his smile was bright enough to rival the afternoon sun. "Meet me by the chapel after morning services, then. Wear sturdy shoes if you have them, and bring a warm cloak. I'll provide food and drink for our journey." After Wren had taken his bread and departed, Eleanor felt as though she were walking on air despite her tired feet and aching muscles. The prospect of spending a day in Wren's company, of seeing the hills she had only glimpsed from a distance, filled her with an excitement that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. The Sabbath morning dawned with a crystalline clarity that seemed to promise something extraordinary. Eleanor woke before the sun had fully risen, her body now beginning to adjust to the early rhythms of village life, though her excitement about the day ahead would have made sleep impossible regardless. She dressed carefully in her simple woolen dress, now showing the marks of several days of honest labor, and wrapped herself in the brown cloak that had become as familiar to her as the fine silk gowns she had left behind at Ravenswood Castle. The thought of the castle brought a momentary pang of guilt as she wondered what chaos her disappearance had caused, but she pushed the feeling aside. Today she would not be Princess Eleanor, trapped by duty and expectation. Today she would simply be Eleanor, a girl going for a walk in the hills with a new friend. Martha had risen early as well, despite the Sabbath being a day of rest, and she pressed a small bundle into Eleanor's hands as she prepared to leave for chapel. "Some bread and cheese for your journey," she said with a warm smile. "And Eleanor, Be careful today, not just with the paths in the hills, though those can be treacherous if you don't know them, but with your heart as well. I see the way you look at Ren, and the way he looks at you. There's something building between you two, quick as summer lightning, and while I won't presume to tell you how to live your life, I want you to remember what we discussed. If you're keeping secrets, child, secrets that will eventually take you away from Millbrook, now would be the time to share them, before anyone gets hurt beyond mending. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, both from embarrassment at being so transparent and from the weight of Martha's wisdom. I will be careful, she promised, though she was not certain she could keep that promise where her own heart was concerned. And Martha, thank you for everything. You have shown me more kindness in these few days than I have known in years, and I will not forget it, whatever may come. The village chapel was a modest stone structure at the eastern edge of Millbrook, its simple bell tower rising above the surrounding buildings, like a gentle reminder of faith and community. Eleanor arrived to find a small crowd already gathered, villagers in their Sabbath best, which for most meant their cleanest and least worn clothing rather than anything truly fine. She spotted Ren immediately, standing slightly apart from the main group, and her breath caught at the sight of him. He had made an effort for the holy day, wearing a tunic of deep blue wool that must have cost him dearly, well fitted to his broad shoulders and lean frame. His dark hair was freshly washed and fell in waves to his shoulders, and he had shaved, revealing the strong line of his jaw. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with a smile that made Eleanor's heart perform an odd little skip in her chest. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "I'm glad you came. I half feared you might change your mind about spending the day tramping through the hills with a shepherd and his flock." There was no artifice in his words, no courtly games or hidden meanings, just honest gladness at her presence, and Eleanor found it refreshing beyond measure. "I would not have missed it for anything," she replied truthfully. "I have been looking forward to this since you extended the invitation yesterday." She hesitated, then added with a shy smile, "Though I confess I am somewhat nervous about meeting your sister. What if she does not approve of me?" Ren laughed, a rich sound that drew glances from several nearby villagers. "Bryn will adore you, I have no doubt. She's been after me for months to bring home a friend, claiming that I work too hard and spend too much time alone with the sheep. She'll be delighted to have another woman to talk to, especially one closer to her own age than the village matrons who usually visit." He paused as the chapel bell began to ring, calling the faithful to worship. "Shall we? The service is usually brief, and then we can be on our way." The service was indeed short, conducted by an elderly priest whose voice wavered with age but whose words carried the weight of deep conviction. Eleanor found herself moved by the simple sincerity of the worship, so different from the elaborate ceremonies at Ravenswood Castle, where religion often seemed more about display than devotion. Here in this small chapel, with farmers and craftsmen and their families gathered together, faith felt real and immediate, a genuine connection to something greater than the struggles of daily life. She noticed that Ren sang the hymns with a clear, strong voice, and that he knelt in prayer with a humility that suggested he took his relationship with the divine seriously. After the service, they walked together toward the edge of the village where Ren had penned his flock the night before. The sheep greeted him with enthusiastic bleating, pressing against the wooden rails of the enclosure in their eagerness to be on their way to fresh pasture. Eleanor watched in fascination as Ren opened the gate and the animals flowed out in an orderly stream, responding to subtle gestures of his shepherd's crook and the soft commands he gave them. There was a poetry to it, she thought, a dance between man and beast built on trust and long familiarity. "Have you ever worked with sheep before?" Ren asked as they began walking, the flock spreading out around them as they headed toward the hills that rose in gentle swells beyond the village. His question was casual, born of natural curiosity, but Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness as she scrambled for an appropriate answer. "No, never," she admitted. "In truth, I have had very little experience with animals of any kind. My father, as I mentioned to Martha, was a clerk, and we lived in a household where such things were handled by others. I'm afraid my education was rather one-sided, focused on books and learning rather than practical skills." It was as close to the truth as she dared come, and she held her breath waiting for his reaction. Ren nodded thoughtfully, his expression showing no judgment. "Well, you'll have ample opportunity to learn today if you're interested. Shepherding is not as simple as it might appear to those unfamiliar with the work. The sheep may look docile enough, but they each have their own personalities, their own quirks and habits. You have to know your flock intimately to keep them safe and healthy. He pointed to a large ewe who walked at the front of the group, her bell ringing with each step. That's Bella, my lead ewe. She's older than most of the others and has a wisdom about her that I've learned to trust. If she's uneasy about a path or a grazing spot, I pay attention, because she's usually right to be cautious. As they climbed higher into the hills, leaving the village behind, Eleanor found herself enchanted by Wren's knowledge of the land and the animals in his care. He pointed out various plants that grew along the path, explaining which were good forage for the sheep and which should be avoided, showing her how to read the subtle signs that indicated water or danger ahead. His voice was patient and encouraging when she asked questions, never making her feel foolish for her ignorance, and Eleanor found herself relaxing in his presence in a way she never had with the young nobleman who had courted her favor at her father's court. The path wound upward through rolling meadows dotted with wild flowers that were just beginning to bloom, their colors bright against the new green grass. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of earth and growing things, and Eleanor breathed deeply, feeling as though she were filling her lungs with freedom itself. Below them, Millbrook grew smaller and smaller, the individual buildings becoming indistinct, until the entire village was just a cluster of shapes in the valley. Beyond it, she could see the silver ribbon of the river winding through the landscape, and in the far distance, the dark mass of the forest through which she had fled on her first night away from the castle. "It's beautiful," she said softly, pausing to take in the view. "I never imagined the world could be so vast, so full of wonder. From here, everything seems both smaller and more significant somehow, as if I can see the whole pattern of life laid out below us." She turned to find Wren watching her with an expression of such warmth and understanding that it made her chest tighten. "I know exactly what you mean," he said quietly. "That's why I love spending time up here in the hills. It gives perspective, reminds me that my problems, as large as they might seem in the moment, are just small parts of a much bigger picture. When my parents died and I thought I would drown under the weight of responsibility, it was coming up here that saved me. The hills don't care about human troubles. They just exist, solid and eternal, and somehow that's comforting." He paused, then added with a self-deprecating smile, "I must sound like a fool, waxing philosophical about hills and sheep." "Not at all," Eleanor assured him earnestly. "I think what you're saying is profound. We spend so much time caught up in the immediate concerns of our lives that we forget to step back and see the larger context. It takes wisdom to recognize that, and courage to seek out the perspective that allows us to keep going when things are difficult." She spoke from her own experience, thinking of the suffocating constraints of her life at court, the way duty and expectation had threatened to crush her spirit before she found the courage to escape, even temporarily. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft bleating of the sheep, the whisper of wind through the grass, and the rhythmic jingle of the bells that hung from the necks of several ewes. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Wren's presence beside her, the way his long strides matched naturally to her shorter ones, the occasional brush of his arm against hers as the path narrowed. There was something building between them. She could feel it as surely as she could feel the warmth of the sun on her face, a connection that went deeper than simple attraction, though that was certainly present as well. It was as if she had known him far longer than just a few days, as if some part of her soul recognized something essential in him and responded to it with a certainty that defied logic. After perhaps an hour of climbing, they crested a ridge, and Eleanor saw a small cottage nestled in a sheltered hollow on the far side. It was a simple structure built of stone with a thatched roof, surrounded by a low wall that enclosed a garden plot and a pen for the sheep. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone was home, and as they drew closer, the door opened and a young girl emerged, waving enthusiastically. "Wren, you're back earlier than I expected," the girl called out, her voice bright with pleasure. She was perhaps 12 or 13 years old, with the same dark hair as her brother, though hers was longer, falling in a thick braid down her back. Her face was animated and pretty, with eyes of a lighter gray than Wren's, almost silver in the sunlight. She wore a simple dress of brown homespun with an apron tied over it, and her feet were bare despite the cool temperature. As she drew closer, her gaze fixed on Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. "And you've brought a guest? Oh, how wonderful. We never have visitors, Wren. You know that. Who is she? Where did you meet her? Is she going to stay for dinner?" Wren laughed at his sister's enthusiasm, reaching out to ruffle her hair in a gesture of obvious affection. "This is Eleanor Bryn. She's new to Millbrook, staying with Martha and Thomas at the bakery. I invited her to walk up to the pastures with me today and thought she might like to meet you. Eleanor, this whirlwind of questions is my sister Bryn, who, as you can see, has no concept of letting a person catch their breath before interrogating them." Bryn made a face at her brother, but turned to Eleanor with a warm smile. "Please forgive my terrible manners. Wren's right that we don't see many people up here, and I get excited when we do. It's lovely to meet you, Eleanor. Will you come inside? I've just made fresh bread, and there's honey to go with it. You must be tired from the climb." Without waiting for an answer, she took Eleanor's hand and began pulling her toward the cottage, chattering all the while about the various improvements she had made to the garden and her plans for planting once the danger of late frost had passed. The interior of the cottage was small but surprisingly comfortable, with a large hearth dominating one wall and simple furniture that showed the marks of careful craftsmanship. The floor was packed earth covered with rushes, and herbs hung drying from the rafters, filling the air with their pleasant scent. Eleanor looked around the modest cottage with genuine appreciation, noting the touches that spoke of care and pride despite limited resources. A small shelf held a few precious books, their leather bindings worn but well maintained, and colorful wildflowers had been arranged in a clay pot on the wooden table that occupied the center of the room. The walls were whitewashed and clean, and though the furnishings were simple, everything had a place and purpose. It was a home in the truest sense, filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth, and everything to do with the love that clearly existed between the brother and sister who lived here. Bryn bustled about, setting out wooden plates and cups, slicing the bread she had mentioned with practiced efficiency. Eleanor offered to help, but the girl waved her toward a bench near the table. "You're our guest, Eleanor. Sit and rest. Wren, there's fresh water in the bucket if you'd pour some for us all." She moved with the confident competence of someone who had been managing a household for years, and Eleanor felt a pang of admiration mixed with sadness for this child who had been forced to grow up too quickly, just as her brother had. As they sat together sharing the simple meal, Bryn peppered Eleanor with questions about her life, her journey to Millbrook, her impressions of the village. Eleanor answered as honestly as she could while maintaining the fiction of her background, and she found herself genuinely enjoying the girl's lively personality and quick intelligence. Bryn was clearly well educated beyond what Eleanor would have expected for a shepherd's sister, and when she commented on this, Wren explained with obvious pride. "Our father believed strongly in the value of learning, regardless of one's station in life," he said, breaking off a piece of bread and dipping it in honey. "He taught both Bryn and myself to read and write, and he left us his small collection of books when he died. I've continued Bryn's education as best I can, though I fear my own knowledge has limits. Still, she reads everything she can get her hands on and has a mind sharp as any scholar's." He smiled at his sister with such affection that Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Wren's being modest," Bryn interjected, rolling her eyes in the way only younger sisters can. "He's actually quite learned himself, though he pretends otherwise. He can recite poetry and knows the histories of the old kings, and he's taught me mathematics well enough that I can help manage the accounts for the flock." She turned to Eleanor with enthusiasm. "Do you read, Eleanor? What sorts of books do you enjoy? I've just finished a collection of tales about King Arthur and his knights, and it was absolutely thrilling, though Wren says half of it is probably made up." "Most of it is probably made up," Wren corrected gently, "but that doesn't make the stories any less valuable. Sometimes truth comes wrapped in fiction, teaching us about courage and honor and loyalty through the adventures of imaginary heroes." He glanced at Eleanor with curiosity. "But yes, I would be interested to know your thoughts on literature as well. You strike me as someone who has spent considerable time with books." Eleanor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I have been fortunate enough to receive a good education, yes. My father believed, as yours did, that learning was important, regardless of one's circumstances. I enjoy histories and poetry, though I confess a weakness for romantic tales as well, stories of people who overcome great obstacles to find happiness together." As she spoke, she was acutely aware of Wren's gaze on her face, those storm-gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Oh, I love those too," Bryn exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "Though Ren always says they're unrealistic, that love in real life is more complicated than it appears in stories. But I think he's just being cynical because he's never been in love himself." She said this last part with a teasing smile at her brother, who shifted uncomfortably on the bench. "I'm being practical," Ren corrected, though there was no real heat in his voice. "Love is a fine thing when it's built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. But the sort of instant, all-consuming passion you read about in tales rarely lasts in the real world. People need to truly know each other, to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses, before they can build something lasting." Even as he spoke, however, his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor, and she wondered if he was thinking, as she was, about the inexplicable connection that had formed between them almost from the first moment they had seen each other. The conversation continued pleasantly as they finished their meal, ranging over topics both serious and lighthearted. Eleanor found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, delighting in the easy camaraderie between the siblings and the way they included her so naturally in their banter. Bryn was witty and sharp, with observations that were often surprisingly insightful for someone her age, and Ren proved to have a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed and comfortable. It was the sort of simple domestic scene that Eleanor had never experienced in the formal atmosphere of Ravenswood Castle, and she treasured every moment of it, even as she felt a growing ache in her chest at the knowledge that this could not last, that eventually she would have to leave all of this behind. After the meal, Ren suggested they walk up to the high pasture where he would leave the flock to graze for the afternoon. Bryn elected to stay behind to work on her studies, though not before extracting a promise from Eleanor to visit again soon. "I like you," the girl said simply as they prepared to leave. "You're different from most of the village women. There's something about you, something refined, but not prideful. I hope you'll come back to see us. Ren needs more friends, even if he's too stubborn to admit it." The walk to the high pasture took them even further up into the hills, following a narrow path that wound between rocky outcrops and patches of heather just beginning to show purple buds. The sheep moved ahead of them at their own pace, finding the tender new grass that grew in sheltered spots and grazing contentedly. Ren walked beside Eleanor, occasionally pointing out features of the landscape or sharing stories about the land and the people who had worked it for generations. His knowledge was extensive and clearly born of deep love for this place, and Eleanor found herself fascinated by everything he told her. "You really love it up here, don't you?" she observed as they paused at a particularly scenic overlook. Below them, the hills rolled away in waves of green and brown, dotted with white shapes of distant sheep flocks. The sky above was a brilliant blue, with only a few white clouds scudding across it in the spring breeze. Not just the beauty of it, though that's certainly remarkable, but the whole way of life, the simplicity and the freedom. Ren considered her words carefully before responding, his expression thoughtful. "I do love it, yes, though I won't pretend it's without its hardships. Winter can be brutal up here, and there are times when I wonder if I made the right choice in continuing my father's work, rather than seeking an easier life in the village or even in a larger town. But then I come up here on a day like this, and I see how the land provides, how the sheep thrive under careful stewardship, and I know that this is where I'm meant to be. There's an honesty to this life, Eleanor. The work is hard, but it's genuine. You can see the results of your labor directly, know that you're providing something of value. That matters to me more than comfort or ease ever could." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his words, though she could not have fully explained why they moved her so deeply. Perhaps it was because he articulated something she had always felt but never been able to express, a longing for purposeful work and authentic connection rather than the empty rituals of court life. Or perhaps it was simply that she recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who valued substance over appearance, truth over convenience. "I think I understand," she said softly. "I have spent most of my life in circumstances where everything was provided for me, where I never had to work for anything or prove my worth through my own efforts. It was comfortable, certainly, but it was also hollow. These past few days in Millbrook, working at the bakery, learning to do things with my own hands, have shown me what I was missing. There's a satisfaction in earning your keep, in knowing that you contribute something meaningful to the world around you. I never realized how much I needed that until I experienced it." Ren turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You're quite remarkable, Eleanor. Most people born to comfortable circumstances never question them, never wonder if there might be more to life than what they've been given. The fact that you were willing to leave that security behind to discover who you might be on your own terms, that takes real courage." He paused, then added more quietly, "I find myself wanting to know everything about you, to understand what shaped you into the person standing before me now. You're a mystery, and mysteries have always fascinated me." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, torn between the desire to tell him everything, to share the truth of her identity and the circumstances that had brought her to Millbrook, and the fear that such honesty would destroy this fragile connection between them. How could she explain that she was a princess, born to privilege and power, destined for a political marriage that would secure alliances and strengthen her father's kingdom? How could she make him understand that this escape was temporary, that no matter how much she might wish otherwise, she would eventually have to return to her gilded cage? And yet keeping such fundamental secrets felt like a betrayal of the genuine bond that was forming between them. "Ren, she began. But before she could continue, a shout from below interrupted them. They both turned to see a rider approaching at speed, his horse laboring up the hillside path. As he drew closer, Eleanor recognized him as one of the men from the village, a farmer named John who had purchased bread from Martha's stall at the market. "Ren, thank God I found you," John called out as he reined in his horse, the animal breathing heavily from the exertion of the climb. "There's trouble in the village. A group of armed men arrived about an hour ago, claiming to be King's soldiers searching for someone. They're questioning everyone, going house to house, and they seem quite determined to find whoever they're looking for. Martha sent me to warn you in case you hadn't heard. Thought you might want to keep young Bryn safe up here until they've moved on." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the full implication of John's words sank in. Her father had sent soldiers to search for her, and it was only a matter of time before they reached Millbrook and began asking questions. Someone might remember seeing a young woman with copper hair and green eyes, might describe her well enough that the soldiers would know they had found their quarry. Her brief taste of freedom was about to end, and the thought of returning to the castle, of facing her father's anger and disappointment, of being forced into the marriage alliance that awaited her, made her feel physically ill. Ren had noticed her reaction, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Eleanor, what's wrong? You've gone pale as milk. Do you know something about these soldiers?" His voice held concern but also a growing suspicion, and Eleanor knew that the moment of truth had arrived. She could no longer hide behind comfortable lies and half-truths. She owed him honesty, even if it cost her everything. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have shared from the beginning, but I was afraid of how you would react, afraid of losing the freedom I had found here." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "My name is Eleanor. That part is true. But I am not the daughter of a minor clerk. I am Princess Eleanor Ashworth, only child of King Harold III, and I ran away from Ravenswood Castle 5 days ago because I could not bear the thought of the life that had been planned for me. Those soldiers are looking for me, Ren. My father has sent them to bring me back." The silence that followed her confession was deafening. Ren stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, his expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been betrayal. John the farmer sat frozen on his horse, clearly having overheard Eleanor's words and unsure how to react. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the rocks and the distant bleating of the sheep, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around them. "A princess," Ren finally said, his voice flat and carefully controlled. "You're a princess, and you've been living in a room above Martha's bakery, working as a common servant, all while letting us believe you were just an ordinary girl seeking work. Did you think this was some sort of game, Eleanor? Did you consider for even a moment how your deception might affect those who befriended you, who welcomed you into their lives?" The hurt in his voice cut Eleanor more deeply than anger would have. "It wasn't like that," she protested, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I never meant to deceive anyone, not truly. I just wanted a few days of freedom, a chance to experience life as it's lived by ordinary people, to make my own choices without the weight of duty and expectation crushing me. I know I should have been honest from the start, especially with you, but I was afraid that if people knew who I really was, they would treat me differently, that I would never have the chance to know what real friendship felt like, what genuine connection between equals could be. Ren ran a hand through his dark hair, his jaw tight with the effort of controlling his emotions. Equals, he repeated, the word carrying a bitter edge. That's a cruel jest, Eleanor, because we were never equals, were we? You're a princess, heir to a kingdom, and I'm a shepherd who lives in a stone cottage with dirt floors. The gap between us is so vast it might as well be an ocean, and yet you let me believe that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be something real developing between us. Was that part of the game as well? Seeing how the simple shepherd would react to the attention of a beautiful woman? No, Eleanor cried out, reaching for his arm, but he stepped back from her touch as if burned. Ren, please, you have to believe me. What I feel for you, what has grown between us these past few days, that is the most real thing I have ever experienced in my entire life. Every word I spoke to you was true, every feeling genuine. Yes, I lied about my identity, and for that I am deeply sorry, but I never lied about who I am as a person, about my thoughts and feelings and dreams. The Eleanor you came to know, she is the real me, more authentic than I have ever been allowed to be at court. John cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly wishing he were anywhere else but caught in the middle of this intensely personal confrontation. Begging your pardons, but those soldiers won't wait forever to search the hills. If your highness intends to continue hiding, we need to make a decision quickly about where you might go. And if you plan to surrender yourself to them, well, that should probably happen sooner rather than later, before they start tearing apart the village looking for you. Ren's expression shifted as the practical implications of the situation began to override his emotional turmoil. Despite his hurt and anger, Eleanor could see him thinking, calculating, his natural protective instincts asserting themselves. How many soldiers? He asked John, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his posture. Perhaps a dozen, well armed and bearing the king's colors. They're led by a nobleman, Lord something or other, didn't catch his full name. Tall fellow with gray eyes and an air about him like he's used to getting his way. He's the one doing most of the questioning. Seems quite determined to find the princess. John shifted in his saddle, his horse stamping impatiently beneath him. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Lord Thornfield, she whispered, recognizing the description immediately. My father must have sent him to lead the search. He's the man who proposed a marriage alliance with my father just before I fled the castle. He has a personal interest in seeing me returned, beyond just serving the king. The thought of being found by Thornfield, of seeing the triumph in his cold gray eyes when he dragged her back to Ravensmoor, made her feel sick with dread. Ren's eyes narrowed at this information, and something hardened in his expression. A marriage alliance. So not only are you a princess, but you're a princess being bargained away to some nobleman for political advantage. Is that what you were running from, Eleanor? An arranged marriage to a man you don't love? There was less accusation in his tone now, more understanding, as if this piece of information helped him make sense of her actions. Yes, Eleanor admitted, grateful for even this small softening in his demeanor. Lord Thornfield is ambitious and calculating, and my father sees the advantage in allying our house with his considerable wealth and influence. I was expected to accept the arrangement with grace and gratitude, to do my duty to the kingdom without complaint. But I could not bear the thought of spending my life with a man who sees me as a prize to be won, rather than a person with thoughts and feelings of my own. So I ran, foolish and reckless as that might have been, because I needed to know what freedom felt like before I was locked into a cage for the rest of my life. Ren was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as he processed everything he had learned. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, some of the sharp edge of anger dulled by understanding, though the hurt remained. I can't imagine what it must be like, to have your entire future decided for you by others, to have no say in the most important decisions of your life, and I understand the impulse to flee, to seek even a brief respite from that kind of pressure. But Eleanor, did you truly not consider the consequences? Your father is a king. He has resources beyond counting, soldiers and nobles loyal to his service. Did you really think you could hide indefinitely in a small village? Did you have any plan beyond escaping? Eleanor shook her head miserably. I had no plan at all beyond getting away from the castle. I told myself I just needed a few days, a week perhaps, to experience the world before returning to accept my fate. But then I met Martha and Thomas, and they were so kind to me. And then I met you and Bryn. and everything changed. Suddenly it wasn't just about escaping something anymore, it was about discovering something wonderful, something I had never known existed. I found friendship and honest work, and the possibility of— She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to put into words the feelings that had been growing in her heart for this shepherd who stood before her with pain and confusion written across his handsome features. The possibility of what? Wren prompted, his voice rough with emotion. Love? Is that what you were going to say, Eleanor? Because I need to know, before this goes any further, before I make any decisions about what to do next. These feelings between us, are they real for you? Or are they just part of your adventure, a romantic fancy that will fade once you return to your real life? Eleanor met his eyes directly, letting him see the truth in her gaze, the depth of emotion that she could no longer hide or deny. They are real, Wren. More real than anything I have ever felt before. I know it has only been a few days. I know that seems impossibly quick, but from the first moment I saw you in the village square, something in me recognized something in you. It was as if my soul had been waiting for yours without even knowing it was incomplete. I understand if you cannot forgive me for lying to you, if the revelation of my true identity has destroyed whatever was building between us. But please believe me when I say that what I feel for you is genuine and deep and unlike anything I have experienced in my entire life. Wren's expression crumbled, the anger and hurt giving way to a vulnerability that took Eleanor's breath away. God help me, but I believe you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and that makes this situation infinitely more complicated, because I feel it too, Eleanor. This connection between us, impossible and irrational as it may be, I feel it in my bones. You walk into my life, this mysterious woman with sad eyes and a longing for freedom, and within days you've turned everything upside down. I can't stop thinking about you, can't imagine my days without the possibility of seeing your face, hearing your laugh, and now I discover that you're so far beyond my reach that it's almost laughable, except I don't feel like laughing at all. John coughed again, more insistently this time. I hate to interrupt, truly I do, but time is not on our side here. Those soldiers will expand their search soon enough, and if they find the princess up here with Wren, there will be questions and consequences that none of us want to face. We need to decide on a course of action. Wren straightened his shoulders, and Eleanor saw the transformation that came over him as he pushed his personal feelings aside to focus on the practical problem at hand. You're right, John. Eleanor, you have a choice to make, and you need to make it quickly. You can go back down to the village and surrender yourself to the soldiers. They'll return you to your father, and while you may face his displeasure for running away, you're his only child, and he loves you. Eventually he will forgive you, and life will go on as it was meant to. Or, he hesitated, then continued with what seemed like great difficulty, or I can help you continue to hide, at least for a while longer. There are places in these hills that few people know about, old shepherds' huts and caves where you could shelter. It would be hard living, and it couldn't last forever, but it would buy you time to think, to figure out what you truly want. Eleanor felt her heart swell with gratitude and love for this man, who, despite his hurt and the complications her identity had introduced, was still willing to help her, still willing to protect her freedom, even knowing it might come at great cost to himself. Wren, I cannot ask you to risk yourself for me. If you're caught helping me hide from the king's soldiers, you could be accused of kidnapping a princess, of treason even. You have Bryn to think of, her safety and future. I will not put either of you in danger because of my selfish desire for a few more days of freedom. Let me worry about the risks, Wren said firmly. I'm offering you a choice, Eleanor, not making it for you. But you need to decide quickly because once those soldiers start climbing into the hills, your options will narrow considerably. He looked at her with such intensity that she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical force. Everything hinged on what she said next, on the choice she made in this crucial instant. Eleanor closed her eyes, thinking through the possibilities with as much clarity as she could muster given the emotional turmoil roiling through her. If she returned to the castle now, surrendered to the soldiers, and accepted her father's judgment, she would likely be married to Lord Thornfield within a matter of weeks. Her brief taste of freedom would become nothing more than a memory, a story she would tell herself in quiet moments when the weight of her crown and her loveless marriage became too much to bear. She would be safe, comfortable, living the life that had been prescribed for her since birth. But she would also be miserable, forever wondering what might have been if she had been brave enough to fight for her own happiness. But if she chose to continue hiding, if she accepted Wren's help and disappeared into the hills, the consequences could be severe for everyone involved. Her father would be frantic with worry, the kingdom would be in an uproar, and Wren would be marked as a criminal if their connection was discovered. It was selfish and reckless and potentially disastrous, and yet the alternative felt like a slow death of the spirit, a gradual extinguishing of everything that made her who she truly was. "I need more time," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet Wren's steady gaze. "Not because I want to play at being a commoner, or because I'm trying to avoid my responsibilities indefinitely, but because I need to think about what I truly want from my life, what I'm willing to sacrifice and what I must fight to preserve. If you're truly willing to help me, Wren, if you think we can hide successfully for even a few more days, then yes, I would be grateful for that chance. But I want you to understand that I'm not asking this lightly, and I will do everything in my power to ensure that you and Bryn are protected from the consequences of my choices." Wren nodded, a flash of something that might have been relief or determination crossing his face. "Then we move quickly. John, ride back to the village and tell Martha what's happened. She'll need to remove any trace of Eleanor's presence from the bakery before the soldiers search there. Tell her also to spread the word among the villagers that if anyone asks, they saw a young woman with copper hair leaving Millbrook 2 days ago, heading east toward the larger towns. It won't hold up under close scrutiny, but it might buy us some time." He turned to Eleanor, his expression serious. "Gather the sheep and start them moving north, toward the high valleys. There's an old stone shelter up there, barely more than a cave really, but it's hidden and defensible. I'll take you there and get you settled. Then I need to come back for Bryn and supplies. We can't all stay up there indefinitely, but we can manage for a few days at least, while we figure out a longer-term solution." John nodded and wheeled his horse around, starting back down the hill at a dangerous pace. The journey to the high valley was arduous, the path growing steeper and more treacherous with every step. Eleanor followed Wren's lead, helping to guide the sheep along narrow trails that wound between rocky outcrops and along the edges of steep drops that made her heart race with fear. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the hills and painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Despite the beauty surrounding them, Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from Wren, the weight of the decision he had made to help her pressing down on his shoulders, like a physical burden. They spoke little during the climb, both too focused on the difficult terrain and their own thoughts to engage in conversation. Eleanor found her mind racing with questions and doubts. Had she made the right choice in accepting Wren's help? Was she being impossibly selfish, dragging him and his sister into danger for the sake of a few more days of freedom? And yet, when she thought about surrendering herself to Lord Thornfield's custody, about returning to the castle to face a future that held no joy or autonomy, something in her rebelled so strongly that she knew she could not have chosen differently. Not yet. Not without at least trying to find another way. After nearly 2 hours of climbing, they reached a narrow valley tucked between 2 steep hillsides, invisible from below and accessible only by the treacherous path they had just traversed. A small stream ran through the center of the valley, providing fresh water, and the grass here was thick and lush, perfect grazing for the sheep. At the far end of the valley, built into the side of the hill itself, was the shelter Wren had mentioned. It was indeed barely more than a cave, its entrance partially blocked by carefully stacked stones that formed a low wall. But Eleanor could see that it would provide protection from the elements and concealment from anyone who might come searching. "This is where the old shepherds used to shelter during the worst of the winter storms," Wren explained as they approached the structure. "My grandfather showed it to my father, and he showed it to me. Very few people know it exists anymore, and fewer still could find it without guidance. You should be safe here, at least for a while." He began settling the sheep, ensuring they had access to water and good grazing, his movements efficient despite the obvious exhaustion that pulled at his features. Eleanor helped as best she could, though her own energy was flagging after the long climb and the emotional turmoil of the day. When the sheep were settled, Wren led her into the shelter, and she saw that it was larger than it had appeared from outside. The interior was dry and relatively clean, with a fire pit near the entrance where smoke could escape through natural vents in the rock above. Someone, probably Wren himself on previous visits, had left a stack of firewood and some basic supplies in a corner, covered with oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. "I'll need to go back for Bryn and gather more provisions," Wren said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "I don't like leaving you alone up here, but I can't bring her up in the dark, and we'll need food and blankets if we're going to stay for any length of time. Will you be all right by yourself for a few hours?" There was genuine concern in his question, and Eleanor felt a rush of warmth despite the cool air inside the shelter. "I'll be fine," she assured him, though in truth the prospect of being alone in this remote place was daunting. "Wren, I want you to know how much I appreciate what you're doing for me. I know the risk you're taking, and I know that your feelings toward me are complicated right now, given everything I've told you. But please believe that I will never forget this kindness, no matter what happens next." Wren stepped closer to her, and in the dim light filtering through the entrance, his eyes seemed to glow with an intensity that took her breath away. "My feelings toward you are not complicated at all, Eleanor. That's what makes this situation so difficult. I'm angry that you lied to me, hurt that you didn't trust me with the truth from the beginning. But beneath all of that, what I feel for you is remarkably simple and terrifyingly strong. I care for you deeply, more deeply, than I have ever cared for anyone outside of my sister. And that caring makes me willing to risk a great deal to keep you safe and to give you the time you need to find your own path forward." Before Eleanor could respond, before she could even fully process what he had said, Wren closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. The embrace was fierce and desperate, as if he were trying to convince himself that she was real, that this impossible situation was actually happening. Eleanor melted into his hold, her arms wrapping around his waist, her face pressed against his chest where she could hear the rapid beating of his heart. They stood like that for a long moment, drawing comfort and strength from each other's presence, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, though she could not have said whether they were born of joy or sorrow or some complex mixture of both. "I have to go," Wren said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'll be back before full dark with Bryn and everything we'll need. Keep the fire small if you light one, and stay inside the shelter. Don't wander, even if you hear strange noises. The hills can be dangerous at night, and I need to know you're safe here waiting for me." He pulled back slightly to look down at her face, and then, with a tenderness that made her heart ache, he reached up to brush away her tears with his thumb. "We'll figure this out, Eleanor. I don't know how yet, but we'll find a way." After Wren had gone, disappearing down the treacherous path with a sureness born of long familiarity, Eleanor built a small fire using the wood that had been left in the shelter. The flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, and she sat before them wrapped in her cloak, trying to order her chaotic thoughts. Everything had happened so quickly, her carefully constructed fiction crumbling in an instant to reveal the truth she had been hiding. And yet, despite Wren's initial anger and hurt, he had chosen to help her, had offered her sanctuary and protection even knowing the risks. That had to mean something. Had to indicate that what was growing between them was strong enough to weather even this revelation. She thought about her father, imagining his reaction when he discovered she was missing. King Harold loved her, she had never doubted that, but he was also a ruler who saw everything through the lens of duty and political advantage. Would he understand why she had fled? Would he see that she was not rejecting him personally, but rather the life he had planned for her? A life that left no room for her own desires or dreams? Or would he view her escape as a betrayal, a selfish act that put the stability of the kingdom at risk? And Lord Thornfield, what would he make of her disappearance? Eleanor shuddered at the thought of his reaction, imagining the cold fury in his gray eyes when he learned that his prospective bride had literally run away rather than accept his proposal. Men like Thornfield did not take kindly to being thwarted, and she suspected he would pursue her with a determination that went beyond simple duty to his king. His pride would demand that she be found and returned, that she be made to understand the consequences of defying him. As the sun set and darkness fell over the hills, Eleanor heard the distant sounds of night creatures beginning their evening activities. Owls hooted from hidden perches, small animals rustled through the grass outside the shelter, and somewhere far off a fox barked its distinctive cry. It should have been frightening, being alone in such a remote place, but Eleanor found the sounds oddly comforting. This was the real world, raw and unfiltered, so different from the artificial safety of the castle where every danger was kept at bay by stone walls and armed guards. Here she was vulnerable but also free, responsible for her own safety but also empowered to make her own choices. She must have dozed off, exhausted by the day's events, because the next thing she knew, Ren was gently shaking her shoulder, his face illuminated by the dying firelight. "Eleanor, wake up. We're here, and we need to get organized before we all collapse from exhaustion." Behind him, she could see Bryn looking around the shelter with wide eyes, her arms laden with bundles that presumably contained the supplies Ren had mentioned. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, embarrassed to have been caught sleeping. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fall asleep. Let me help with those bundles." She moved to take some of the burden from Bryn, who smiled at her gratefully, despite the obvious questions in her eyes. Ren explained everything on the way up, Bryn said as they began unpacking the supplies. "About who you really are, about the soldiers looking for you, about why we're hiding up here in this old shelter. I have to say, finding out that my brother's new friend is actually a princess was quite a shock, but I suppose it explains why you seem so different from other people I've met. You have a bearing about you, a way of carrying yourself that speaks of education and refinement." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "I never meant to deceive anyone, least of all you and Ren. I was just so desperate to experience life as an ordinary person, to be treated as Eleanor rather than Princess Eleanor, that I let the deception continue longer than I should have. I hope you can forgive me for that." Bryn waved a hand dismissively, already moving on to more practical concerns. "There's nothing to forgive. I think what you did was brave, running away like that to find your own path. Most people in your position would have simply accepted their fate, but you had the courage to question whether that fate was really what you wanted. I admire that, even if it has created rather a mess for all of us to sort out." She began arranging blankets on the floor of the shelter, creating sleeping areas for the three of them. "Now, we need to talk about what happens next, because hiding in a cave indefinitely is not a sustainable solution to this problem." Ren, who had been building up the fire to provide more warmth and light, turned to face them both. "Bryn's right. This shelter will keep us safe for a few days, maybe a week if we're careful with our supplies, but eventually we'll be found or we'll run out of food. We need a real plan, something that addresses the root of the problem rather than just postponing it." He looked at Eleanor with an expression that was both gentle and serious. "Eleanor, I need you to be completely honest with me now. What do you actually want? If you could choose any outcome for this situation, what would it be?" Eleanor sat down on one of the blankets Bryn had arranged, drawing her knees up to her chest as she considered the question. "What I want seems impossible," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "I want to be free to make my own choices about my life, to marry someone I love rather than someone chosen for political advantage. I want to be valued for who I am as a person rather than what I represent as a symbol of royal power. But I also don't want to abandon my responsibilities entirely or cause my father pain. He's not a cruel man, Ren. He loves me in his way, but he's been a king for so long that he sees everything through the lens of duty and obligation. He genuinely believes that arranging a good marriage for me is the best way to ensure my happiness and security." "Then perhaps," Ren said thoughtfully, settling himself on the floor across from her, "the solution is not to run away from your father permanently, but to convince him that his current plan is not in anyone's best interest. If you could make him understand why you object to marrying Lord Thornfield, if you could show him that there are other ways to secure the stability he seeks, perhaps he would be willing to reconsider." Eleanor shook her head sadly. "You don't understand how these things work in the world of nobility, Ren. Marriage alliances are carefully negotiated, sometimes over years. My father has likely already made promises to Lord Thornfield, commitments that he cannot easily break without damaging his honor and his political relationships. And even if he were willing to call off this particular marriage, he would simply arrange another one with a different nobleman. The fundamental problem remains the same." "Unless," Bryn interjected, her young voice cutting through the darkness with surprising authority, "you present him with an alternative that he finds acceptable. What if you were already married to someone else? Then Lord Thornfield's proposal would be moot, and your father would have to accept the situation as it stands." Both Eleanor and Ren turned to stare at the girl, who looked back at them with an expression of perfect innocence that didn't quite hide the mischief dancing in her silver eyes. "Bryn, that's not helpful," Ren said firmly. "Eleanor can't just marry some random person to escape an unwanted engagement. Marriage is a sacred bond. not a political maneuver to be entered into lightly. I wasn't suggesting she marry a random person, Bryn replied archly. I was suggesting she marry you. The silence that followed Bryn's suggestion was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant bleating of sheep settling down for the night. Eleanor felt her heart stop and then race forward at double speed, her mind reeling at the audacity of the proposal even as something deep inside her leaped at the possibility. Marry Wren. The idea was absurd, impossible, a fantasy that could never work in the real world where princesses did not wed shepherds, no matter how kind or handsome or worthy those shepherds might be. And yet, looking across the firelight at Wren's stunned expression, seeing the conflict playing across his features as he processed his sister's words, Eleanor found herself wanting it with an intensity that frightened her. Bryn, that's enough, Wren said, his voice strained. You're talking about things you don't fully understand. Eleanor is a princess, heir to a kingdom. I'm a shepherd who lives in a cottage with dirt floors. The distance between our stations is not something that can be bridged simply because we happen to care for each other. The world doesn't work that way, especially not in matters of royal succession and political power. Why not? Bryn challenged, her chin lifting stubbornly. You're always telling me that character matters more than birth, that a person's worth is determined by their actions rather than their title. Were you lying all those times, Wren? Or did you only mean it when it was a comfortable philosophical position, rather than something that might actually affect your own life? Her words were sharp, cutting through her brother's objections with the brutal honesty of youth. Eleanor watched the exchange with a mixture of hope and trepidation, afraid to speak lest she break whatever spell was forming in this moment. Wren ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of deep agitation, and when he looked at Eleanor, she saw a war being fought behind his storm-gray eyes. It's not that simple, Bryn, and you know it, he said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. Even if Eleanor and I were to marry, which is a monumental if, her father is the king. He could simply annul the marriage, declare it invalid because it was performed without his consent. Or worse, he could view me as having kidnapped and compromised his daughter, and I would face execution for treason. You would be left alone with no one to care for you, and all because I allowed myself to dream impossible dreams. But what if it could work? Eleanor heard herself saying, her voice quiet but steady despite the trembling she felt throughout her entire body. What if we approached it differently, not as a deception but as a genuine choice that I'm making about my own future? Wren, you said yourself that my father loves me. What if we went to him together, presented ourselves honestly, and asked for his blessing? What if I told him that I've found someone worthy of my love, someone who treats me as an equal and values me for who I am rather than what I represent? Wren looked at her as if she had suggested they sprout wings and fly to the moon. Eleanor, your father is a king. He's not going to bless his only daughter's marriage to a common shepherd, no matter how pretty a speech you make about love and equality. He'll see me as an opportunist who took advantage of your vulnerability, who seduced you while you were running away from your responsibilities. And he would be within his rights to think that, because from his perspective that's exactly what it would look like. Then we make sure it doesn't look like that, Eleanor said, leaning forward with growing conviction as an idea began to take shape in her mind. We don't ask for his blessing to marry immediately. We ask for time, for the opportunity to court properly, for him to get to know you and see your character for himself. Wren, you're educated, articulate, and hardworking. You've raised your sister alone since you were 17, managed to keep your flock thriving through harsh winters and difficult seasons, and you're respected throughout the region for your integrity. Those are qualities that any father would value in a potential son-in-law, royal or not. You're forgetting one crucial detail, Wren pointed out, though Eleanor could hear the faint stirring of hope beneath his skepticism. I'm not noble. I have no title, no lands beyond a small cottage and a garden plot, no wealth or political connections. What could I possibly offer a princess that would make me an acceptable match in a king's eyes? Bryn, who had been watching this exchange with barely contained excitement, spoke up again. What about the old stories, the ones Father used to tell us? About King Harold's own grandfather, who was a minor knight with nothing to his name when he married the previous king's daughter. He proved himself through deeds and character, and eventually he inherited the throne. If it happened before, why couldn't it happen again? Eleanor felt a surge of excitement as Bryn's words triggered a memory from her own education. Bryn's right. she said urgently. My great-grandfather was indeed a minor noble who married up into royalty. And there are other precedents throughout English history, times when rulers chose to elevate worthy commoners to positions of power and influence. It's not unheard of, just uncommon. If I could convince my father that you possess the qualities necessary to eventually share the burden of rule, if I could make him see that love and partnership between a king and queen matter as much as political advantage, perhaps he would at least consider the possibility. Ren was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire as he turned these ideas over in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were testing the weight of each word before releasing it. Even if all of that were true, even if your father were willing to consider me as a potential match for you, there's still the matter of Lord Thornfield. You said yourself that your father has likely made commitments to him already. Breaking off that alliance could have serious political consequences, might even lead to conflict between your father's house and Thornfield's supporters. Would you really ask your father to risk that for the sake of your personal happiness? Eleanor felt the weight of that question settle over her like a heavy cloak. It was the crux of the matter, the point where her desires as an individual woman collided with her responsibilities as a princess. For her entire life, she had been taught that duty came before personal preference, that the needs of the kingdom outweighed any individual's wants or dreams. And yet, sitting here in this remote shelter with a man who had risked everything to give her a chance at freedom, with his brave young sister who saw the world with such clarity, Eleanor found herself questioning those old certainties. I would, she said finally, meeting Ren's eyes across the firelight with a determination that came from somewhere deep in her soul. I would ask him to prioritize my well-being over political convenience, to remember that I am his daughter before I am a princess, a person with feelings and dreams before I am a pawn to be moved around a political chessboard. And if he truly loves me as I believe he does, if he has any understanding of what it means to live without love or hope of happiness, then perhaps he will find a way to make it work. Lord Thornfield is ambitious, yes, but my father is the king. He has other ways to placate an ambitious nobleman that don't involve sacrificing his daughter's future. Ren stood up abruptly and began pacing the confines of the shelter, his long strides eating up the small space in just a few steps before he had to turn and pace back. Eleanor watched him, recognizing the signs of a man grappling with a decision that would change the entire course of his life. She wanted to go to him, to take his hands and tell him that they would face whatever came together, but she forced herself to remain still, to give him the space he needed to work through his thoughts. If we do this, Ren said finally, stopping his pacing to face Eleanor directly, if we actually go to your father and present ourselves as a couple seeking his blessing to court, we need to be absolutely certain about what we're doing. This isn't a game or a temporary rebellion against authority, Eleanor. This is us declaring to the world that we have found something worth fighting for, something worth the political complications and social scandal and personal risk. I need to know that you're sure, truly sure, that what you feel for me is strong enough to weather all of that. Eleanor rose from her seat and crossed the distance between them, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the shelter could hear it. She took Ren's hands in hers, feeling the calluses on his palms from years of honest work, the strength in his fingers as they closed around hers. Ren Blackwood, she said, her voice steady and clear despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I have known you for less than a week, which by any rational standard is far too short a time to make a decision of this magnitude. But in that brief time, you have shown me more genuine kindness, more respect and understanding than I have experienced in 20 years at court. You have treated me as an equal, valued my thoughts and feelings, and offered me the freedom to be myself without judgment or expectation. When I look at you, I don't see a shepherd or a commoner. I see a man of integrity and courage, someone who has faced terrible hardships and emerged from them with his compassion and honor intact. I see someone I could build a life with, someone I could trust to stand beside me through whatever challenges we might face. So yes, I am sure, more sure than I have ever been about anything in my entire life. The emotion that flashed across Ren's face was so intense it took Eleanor's breath away. He raised one hand to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the trembling she could feel in his fingers. I feel the same way, he said, his voice rough with feeling. God help me, but I fell for you the moment I saw you standing in Martha's bakery, looking at the world with such wonder and longing. Every moment I've spent with you since has only deepened those feelings. You're brave and kind and so much stronger than you give yourself credit for. The thought of you being forced to marry a man you don't love, of never seeing you again, of losing you before I've even really had the chance to know you, it's unbearable. So if there's even the smallest chance that we can make this work, that we can build a future together, then I'm willing to face whatever consequences come with that choice." Bryn, who had been watching this exchange with shining eyes, let out a small squeal of delight. "Does this mean you're going to get married? Should I start planning a wedding?" Her enthusiasm was infectious, and despite the gravity of the situation, both Eleanor and Wren found themselves laughing. "Not quite yet," Wren said, though he was smiling as he spoke. "First, we need to actually speak with Eleanor's father, and that's going to be difficult and potentially dangerous. We need to think carefully about how we approach him, what we say, and how we say it. This can't look like an impulsive decision made by a runaway princess and the shepherd who helped her hide. It needs to be presented as a thoughtful choice made by two people who understand the implications of what they're asking." Eleanor nodded, her mind already racing ahead to plan their approach. "We should go to him together, tomorrow if possible. The longer we wait, the more worried he'll be, and the angrier Lord Thornfield will become. If we present ourselves voluntarily, if I take responsibility for my actions and explain my reasoning, my father might be more inclined to listen. And Wren, you'll need to speak for yourself as well, to show him the man you are through your own words and bearing. My father values courage and honesty above almost everything else. If you can demonstrate those qualities, you'll have a better chance of winning his respect." They talked long into the night, planning their strategy, anticipating objections and preparing responses, building the case they would present to King Harold. Bryn eventually fell asleep, curled up in her blankets near the fire, but Eleanor and Wren continued their discussion in hushed voices, both too keyed up by the magnitude of what they were about to attempt to even consider sleeping. As the night wore on and the fire burned down to glowing embers, Wren reached out and took Eleanor's hand, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that felt both intimate and completely natural. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said softly, "whatever your father decides, I want you to know that these past few days have been the most extraordinary of my life. You've changed everything for me, Eleanor. You've shown me that there's more to existence than just surviving, more to relationships than duty and obligation. Even if your father refuses to allow us to be together, even if we have to part ways and never see each other again, I will treasure the memory of this time for the rest of my days." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, though whether they were born of joy or fear or the overwhelming love she felt for this remarkable man, she could not say. "It won't come to that," she whispered fiercely. "I won't let it. We've found something rare and precious, Wren, something worth fighting for. And I intend to fight with everything I have to make sure we have a future together." As dawn broke over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the three of them prepared to descend from their hiding place and make the journey to Ravenswood Castle. Eleanor had never been more terrified or more certain of anything in her life. She was about to face her father's wrath, to challenge centuries of tradition and protocol, to ask for something that by all conventional wisdom should be impossible. But as she looked at Wren, saw the love and determination in his gray eyes, felt the strength of his hand in hers, she knew that she would not back down, would not accept any outcome that did not include the possibility of a life spent with this man who had shown her what true partnership could be. The journey back to Millbrook and then on to the castle took most of the day. As they traveled, they encountered several groups of soldiers still searching the countryside for the missing princess, and each time Eleanor's heart raced with anxiety. But Wren guided them along paths that avoided the main search parties, his knowledge of the land allowing them to remain undetected until they were ready to reveal themselves. By late afternoon, they stood before the imposing gates of Ravenswood Castle, the same gates Eleanor had slipped through less than a week ago in her desperate bid for freedom. The guards recognized her immediately, their shock evident as they scrambled to attention and sent runners to inform the king of his daughter's return. Within minutes, the courtyard was filled with people, servants and soldiers and courtiers, all staring at the princess who had vanished and now returned accompanied by a common shepherd and his young sister. King Harold emerged from the great hall, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Relief warred with anger, joy with stern disapproval, and Eleanor saw the moment when his eyes shifted from her to Wren, taking in the way they stood close together, the way Wren's hand rested protectively at the small of her back. The king's expression hardened, and Eleanor knew that the confrontation she had been preparing for was about to begin. "Eleanor," her father said, his voice carefully controlled, though she could hear the emotion beneath it. "You have caused great worry and distress with your disappearance. I trust you have a good explanation for your actions, and for the company you're keeping." His gaze fixed on Wren with undisguised suspicion, and Eleanor felt her companion stiffen beside her. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor stepped forward, keeping her head high and her voice steady. "Father, I do have an explanation, and I hope you will hear me out completely before you pass judgment. I ran away from the castle because I could not bear the thought of being forced into a marriage with Lord Thornfield, a man I do not love and who sees me as nothing more than a political advantage. In my time away, I met Wren Blackwood, who showed me kindness without knowing who I was, who treated me as an equal, and valued me for myself. I have come to care for him deeply, Father, and he for me. We have returned to ask for your blessing to court properly, to give us the chance to build a relationship that could one day lead to marriage." The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. She could see the shock on her father's face, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, could sense the scandal that was about to erupt. But before anyone could speak, Wren stepped forward, his bearing confident despite the enormous gulf in status between himself and the king he was addressing. "Your Majesty," Wren said, his voice clear and respectful, but not servile, "I understand that my position makes me an unlikely suitor for your daughter. I have no title, no wealth, no political connections that could benefit your kingdom. But I can offer Princess Eleanor something that I believe is equally valuable: genuine love, respect, and partnership. I have seen her courage and intelligence, her kindness and strength of character. She deserves to be cherished for who she is, not simply valued for what she represents. If you will grant me the opportunity to prove myself worthy of her, I swear on my honor that I will dedicate my life to ensuring her happiness and supporting her in whatever role she is called to fulfill." King Harold studied Wren for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze shifted back to Eleanor, and she saw something in his eyes that gave her hope. It was understanding, painful and reluctant, but real nonetheless. Her father was remembering his own youth perhaps, remembering what it felt like to love and be loved in return, remembering that beneath his crown he was still a man who had once made promises to the woman he had married. "This is highly irregular," the king said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility, "and it will cause considerable political difficulty. Lord Thornfield will not take kindly to being passed over for a common shepherd, and there are those at court who will see this as a dangerous precedent, a weakening of the distinctions that maintain social order." He paused, then added more softly, "But you are my daughter, Eleanor, and I have failed you if I've made you feel that your happiness means nothing to me. I will not force you into a marriage that would make you miserable, regardless of the political advantages it might bring." Eleanor felt her heart soar with hope, but her father raised a hand to forestall any celebration. "However," he continued sternly, "neither will I simply hand you over to the first man who shows you kindness and tells you what you want to hear. Wren Blackwood, if you truly wish to court my daughter, you will do so under my supervision, here at court, where I can observe your character and judge whether you possess the qualities necessary to one day share in the governance of this kingdom. Eleanor, you will return to your duties as princess, and you will give your word that there will be no more running away, no more deceptions. If this relationship is genuine, it will withstand the scrutiny and obstacles that will inevitably come its way. If it is merely a rebellion against authority or a romantic fancy born of unusual circumstances, that too will become apparent in time." It was not the immediate approval Eleanor had hoped for, but it was far more than she had dared to expect. She looked at Wren and saw her own relief and cautious optimism reflected in his face. They had won the first battle, gained the precious time they needed to prove that what they felt for each other was real and lasting. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and opposition, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. "Thank you, Father," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "I give you my word that I will not run away again, and I will fulfill my duties as princess to the best of my ability. All I ask is the chance to follow my heart while honoring my responsibilities to the kingdom." King Harold nodded slowly, then turned to address the assembled crowd. "Let it be known that Princess Eleanor has returned safely to Ravenswood Castle. The search is concluded, and all soldiers may return to their regular duties. As for the rest, there will be much to discuss in the coming days and weeks. But for now, let us simply be grateful that the princess is home and well." He gestured to his guards. "Escort Eleanor to her chambers so she may rest and refresh herself. Wren Blackwood and his sister will be given quarters in the castle as my guests. We will speak more of these matters tomorrow, when cooler heads can prevail." As Eleanor was led away toward her tower, she looked back over her shoulder at Wren, who stood in the courtyard watching her go. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, a silent promise passed between them. They had taken the first step on a journey that would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. But whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. For Eleanor had found not just love in her brief escape from the castle, but also herself, the strong, capable woman she was meant to be. And Wren had discovered that sometimes the most unlikely dreams can come true if you have the courage to reach for them. In the days and weeks that followed, Wren proved himself at court through his intelligence, his work ethic, and his unwavering devotion to Eleanor. King Harold, watching carefully, saw in the young shepherd the qualities he had hoped to find: honesty, courage, and a genuine love for his daughter that went beyond ambition or self-interest. Lord Thornfield, furious at being passed over, eventually withdrew his suit and sought an alliance elsewhere, mollified by certain trade concessions that benefited his holdings. The court slowly accepted the unprecedented match, won over by Wren's character and Eleanor's obvious happiness. A year later, in a ceremony that combined the grandeur of royal tradition with the simplicity that both bride and groom valued, Princess Eleanor Ashworth married Wren Blackwood in the great hall of Ravenswood Castle. Bryn served as her sister's witness, beaming with pride at the role she had played in bringing them together. And as Eleanor and Wren spoke their vows before God and the assembled nobility of the realm, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days, they knew that they had found something more precious than any crown or title: a partnership built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the freedom to choose their own destiny. The princess who had run away from the castle to see the world had found not just freedom, but love, and in doing so, she had changed not only her own fate, but the very nature of what it meant to be royal in her kingdom. And they lived, as the old stories say, happily ever after, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single brave step into the unknown.